Hello and welcome back to another video. So today I've got another full PC build guide for you. So I'm going to be showing you how to put all these parts together and come up with a fully functioning PC by the end of it. So let's have a look at the parts. Okay, so starting off with the case, this is the AZZA Pyramid Mini 806 and this is an ITX case. So ITX has some advantages and disadvantages. I think the biggest advantage is that you can fit a lot of hardware into quite a small space. So it's hopefully going to take up less space on your desk. Obviously with this case having a pyramid shape, the footprint at the bottom is quite big, so it still is going to take up a large amount of space on your desk. The downside I think to ITX is there is some limitations to what you can put in it, and I'll cover this when we look at the other parts. And building in an ITX case is a bit more complicated than building in a slightly bigger case. So if it is your first build, you might want to take a look at some of my other build guides. Although I am going to make a full step-by-step guide, so you should be able to follow along, even if it is your first build. But be aware this is going to be a little bit more tricky than building in a bigger case. Okay, for the motherboard, I've gone with the ROG Strix X570i Gaming. So this is an ITX motherboard. So if you're not going to get the same one as me, make sure it's ITX, otherwise it's not going to fit in this case. For the CPU, I've gone for the Ryzen 7 3700X. So this is an 8-core CPU, and it should perform well in gaming, and it's also going to be very capable for content creation and video editing. So we are expecting new Ryzen CPUs before the end of the year, so if you want to change this for one of the latest models, the steps should be fairly similar. Okay, keeping the CPU cool, I've got a 120mm AIO from AZZA. It's the ROG Strix LC120 RGB. And I think going down the AIO route is going to be your best bet for cooling in this case, because the maximum height for CPU coolers is limited to 85mm. So that's really going to limit what you're going to be able to do with air cooling. And I don't think the thermals in this case are going to be particularly good. So a 120mm AIO is probably going to give us the best results. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Trident Z Neo at 3600 MHz speed, which is the sweet spot for the Ryzen 3000 CPUs. Powering the whole build, I've got a 750 watt power supply from Corsair. It's their SF750, which is an SFX power supply. So this is smaller than a standard power supply, and this case is only compatible with SFX power supplies. For the GPU, I've gone with the RTX 2070 Super. And I'm fully aware by the time a lot of you are watching this, the new NVIDIA 3000 cards are going to be available. So feel free to swap the graphics card out for a different card, but just be aware of the size constraints in this case. The maximum length of GPU supported is 280mm. Okay, going on to storage. So this motherboard supports two M.2 SSDs, and I've got two 1TB M.2 SSDs from Samsung, the 970 EVO, which I've used in previous builds and have always performed really well. Again, feel free to go for a PCIe Gen 4 SSD, and I've just got the 970 EVOs lying about, so that's why I've gone for them for this build. So as well as the two M.2 SSDs from Samsung, I've also picked up a SATA SSD. It's the T-Force Delta RGB, and the main reason for picking it up is purely aesthetics. So this case is a little bracket on the front of it where you can mount an SSD in a vertical orientation. And I think the RGB in this SSD is going to look great on display in the front of the case. Okay, so that's all the parts. Let's get on with the build. Okay, so the first thing I like to do in any build is to prepare the case. And that involves removing any panels or dust filters that are going to get in our way. So this case has one solid outer panel, which we need to remove, and it's held on with 4 spring-loaded thumb screws on the bottom of the case. Okay, so we just need to loosen the thumb screws at the bottom of the case. And same again on the other side. Okay, so now you should just be able to lift the top panel off. Okay, so most cases you buy will come with an accessory pack containing all the screws that you're going to need to secure everything during the build. And as well, you quite often get some cable ties for cable management at the end. So we can see down the bottom here, we've got 2 plastic bags. So we'll free these up and see what's in them. Okay, so that's what's inside the accessory pack. We've got a little packet of screws here, which we're going to need to secure our motherboard, hard drive and power supply into the case. We've got a range of cable ties, standard cable ties and some Velcro cable ties, and we've also got a PCIe riser cable which we're going to need to use for our graphics card. Okay, next thing for us to do is to remove this bracket and fan from the case, because we're going to need to fit our radiator on the underside of this bracket, and it's going to be much easier to do out of the case. So the little bracket is held on with 2 screws at each corner of the pyramid. So the cables coming from the fan are hidden in this side of the case. So there's an additional 2 screws that we're going to need to remove to get the cable cover off, so we're going to be able to remove the fan and bracket. Okay, so that's the little bracket free, so it's just a matter of moving the 2 extra screws to get this cable cover off, and then we're going to be able to get the bracket and fan out in one piece. Okay, at the bottom of the case, down below where the GPU is going to go, there is a removable dust filter held on with magnets. It's actually not going to get in the way for this build, so I'm going to leave it in place. Okay, so that's the case ready to go. Next thing is to start work on the motherboard. Okay, so this is our motherboard, and we want to do as much work with the motherboard as we can on the table before we put it into the case, because it's much easier to get access to the motherboard here than it is in the cramped confines of a case. So the first thing we're going to do is install our CPU, which is going to go into this socket in the middle of the motherboard. So to prepare the socket to receive the CPU, all we need to do is lift this little lever. So I'm going to lift it here all the way over to the right hand side, and our socket's now ready to take the CPU. So before we put our CPU into the socket, I want to point something out to you. If you look at this top left hand corner, you notice there's a little triangle on the socket itself. None of the other corners in the socket have this triangle. So we're going to use this triangle to help us line the CPU up in the socket in the right orientation. Okay, so this is our CPU, and what you'll notice is I'm holding it by the sides. And the reason for that is I don't want to damage the gold pins on the bottom of the CPU. Now what you'll notice if you look carefully at the CPU, down the bottom left hand corner there's a little gold mark, and if I turn it over, in the same corner there's a little gold triangle. So we're going to line the triangle on the CPU up with the triangle on the socket. Okay, so I've lined the triangle up on the CPU with the triangle on the socket, and all I want to do is hover the CPU over the socket and let it fall into place. So here there it's fallen into place. Really important, I'm not going to go pressing down on it to check it's in, because I can damage the pins that way. The next thing I need to do is just close this little lever to secure the CPU in the socket, and we've now installed the CPU. Okay, next thing for us to do is install our M.2 SSDs. So this motherboard has 2 M.2 SSD sockets. We've got one behind this little heatsink on the front, and then if we have a look at the back of the motherboard, we can see the socket just here, and there's no heatsink over the one on the back. So we can already see the 2 sockets in our motherboards aren't equal. The one on the front is going to run cooler because of the heatsink, and the one on the back is going to be slightly hotter. Importantly, in a lot of motherboards there tends to be a faster socket and a slower socket. There's a very slight difference in our motherboard in that the M.2 socket on the front goes directly to the CPU, while the one on the back goes to the chipset first. So the one in the front will be slightly faster than the one in the back, although in real life you'll never notice any difference. In other motherboards there can be a significant difference between the 2 M.2 SSDs, so it's really important you check your manual to decide where you're going to put it if you've only got one, or which of the drives you're going to want to use for a certain purpose if you've got more than one. So we've got exactly the same drive, so we're going to put one in the front and one in the back. So to get access to the M.2 SSD socket, we need to remove these 2 little screws to get the heatsink off. Okay, so now I should just be able to lift the heatsink off. Okay, this is our M.2 SSD. Over the right hand side you'll see the little connectors that are going to plug into the motherboard, and over the left hand side you'll see where the screw is going to secure it into place. Okay, so this is our M.2 SSD socket over to the right hand side here. And towards the left hand side here we've got a little standoff where we're going to put a screw which comes in the motherboard box into to secure the M.2 SSD in place. So all we want to do is insert the M.2 SSD at a slight angle into this gold connector. Okay, then in the motherboard box we're going to get out a little screw which we can use to secure the SSD in place. Okay, so before we put the heatsink back on, there's two things I want to point out. The first is, if we look at the back of it, if you're using this for the first time, there's going to be some plastic protection over here, which you're going to need to remove. The second thing is, if you look here, there's some electrical pins, so we're going to have to be really careful to line these up when we're putting the heatsink back on. Okay, now all we need to do is reinsert the two screws which we have removed. Okay, on the back of the motherboard, it's a very similar process. We're just going to insert the M.2 SSD in at a slight angle and then secure it down with the screw which we're going to get in our motherboard box. Okay, so a word of caution here before moving on. Adding a second M.2 SSD to the back of the motherboard is quite easy at this stage. Although once you put it into the build, it can be much more difficult, as in a lot of cases you're going to have to actually entirely remove the motherboard, which means removing everything that's connected to get access to the back of it to add an M.2 SSD in the future. So think really carefully at the start if you're going to want a second one, and if you are, I would do it at this stage. So the next thing for us to do is install our HD audio extension cable, which comes with the motherboard. So in most motherboards, the HD audio connector is down the bottom left-hand side of the motherboard. So in our motherboard, it's hiding down here beneath this little panel. So the motherboard comes with a little extension cable, which we're going to need to plug in. Okay, so we just need to remove this screw to get the panel off. Okay, we should now just be able to lift this little panel off. And you can see the socket down here. Okay, so it's just a matter of lining the pins up with the cable, and it should then just push into place. And then we can just go ahead and replace the little cover. And then screw things in again. So when I'm doing an ITX build, I like to plug in as many cables as I can while the motherboard is on the table, because normally in ITX builds you've very limited access to the motherboard. We're not too bad in this case, because with the pyramid cover off, there's actually quite a bit of room, but I'm still going to go ahead and plug in our front panel connector extension cable. And that's one of the nice things about this motherboard, that they give you lots of extension cables to make the whole process that wee bit easier. Because otherwise you'd be trying to plug in each of the front panel connectors into the header here. Whereas all we need to do is plug in the end of this cable, and then we've got lots of separate connectors, which is much easier to join the cables coming from the case into than having to try and get them directly into the pins here. Okay, so although this looks like one connector, it's actually two separate connectors. So it's the first two rows of pins closest to my finger are where we're going to plug this cable into. Okay, so you'll notice there's a pin missing in the top row, so it's important we line our connector up the right way round. So there we go. And then it's just a matter of pushing down to secure in place. Okay, so next cable I want to plug in is the SATA cable for our SATA SSD, and you can see we've got SATA ports here, 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 and here. So it makes sense for me just to go to the next one down and plug in a SATA data cable. Okay, so I just need to line the L up on the connector with the L on the socket, and then it's just a matter of pushing and it will lock into place. So the next thing for us to do is install our RAM, and a RAM is going to go into these two sockets here. So to prepare the sockets to receive the RAM, all we need to do is open the little clips here. Okay, so this is our RAM, and what you'll notice is there's two gold connectors along the bottom of it. Importantly, they're not of the same length. You'll notice the one on the right hand side is slightly longer than the one on the left hand side. So it's important we line the RAM up correctly in the socket when we're installing it. Okay, so we just need to line the RAM up with the socket. Okay, and once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just a matter of applying some firm pressure to the top of the RAM, and it will push down, and you'll notice the little clip has locked with our RAM secured into place. Okay, just the same process with the second stick of RAM, so we line things up at each side. And then once we're happy, a matter of just applying firm pressure again, and it clicks and locks into place. So for most ITX builds, I would recommend plugging in the 24-pin power supply cable and also the 8-pin power supply cable for the CPU at the top left-hand corner of the motherboard. Particularly the CPU one can be quite difficult once the motherboard is in the case. Although with our particular pyramid shaped case, we're going to have plenty of room at the top of the case to get access to plug these cables in when we install our power supply. So I'm going to leave that for now. So the next thing for us to do is to remove these little brackets which would hold on the stock CPU cooler and install the standoffs which came with our AIO. Okay, so just a matter of removing the screws. And what I would recommend is doing one bracket at a time, because this one is holding on the back plate, and if you take all 4 out, the back plate might become loose. And for most ITX builds, you might actually want to go ahead and install your CPU cooler at this stage, but because we're going to have plenty of access to the top of the case, I'm going to leave it to later in the build. Okay, so the next stage for most builds will actually be to go ahead and put the motherboard into the case. Now the problem if we do this, so we put our motherboard in here, we're going to be blocking access to the bottom of the case. So this is quite a unique case, and we're going to have to build in a completely different order than what I would be used to. So we're going to have to start down the bottom and work our way up. So down the bottom left hand side of the case is where the graphics card is going to go, and at the back of the case is where the power supply is going to go. So we're going to actually start with the graphics card and power supply. Okay, so our graphics card is going to go into here, and you can see the little bracket over the left hand side to secure it into place. So there's 2 little supports here which the graphics card is going to rest on, just above this little dust filter down the bottom. So our graphics card is going to have to go in with the intake fans facing up the way. It's the only way for it to fit into the bracket over the left hand side. And this seems like a slightly odd choice to me, because it would be much better to have the intake fans facing down, getting cool air from the bottom of the case through this dust filter, instead of taking hot air in from the case. So I imagine our graphics card temperatures mightn't be the best, but we'll find out at the end when we come on to do the thermal testing. So to install the graphics card, all we need to do is rest it on these little supports and then slide it into place. Now there's a little bracket over the left hand side, so we're just going to slot that into place. Okay, and then we just need to secure the graphics card in place using 2 of the screws which came with the case. Okay, next thing for us to do is to plug the supplied riser cable into the back of the graphics card. So we just need to open the clip on the riser cable and line it up with the back of the graphics card. Now I'm just going to support the graphics card with my hand at the other side, and then I'm going to push firmly into place. And you hear that little click as the card locks into the riser cable. Now we're going to plug the other end of the riser cable into the motherboard whenever we install it. Okay, next thing to install is our power supply, and it's going to go up against this bracket at the bottom of the case. To make things easier, I'm just going to free up these cables coming from the front panel of the case. Okay, so this is our power supply. You'll notice it's pretty small and compact, and that's because it's the SFX power supply, and that's the only type of power supply that's compatible with this case. Now you'll notice there's no cables plugged into the front of our power supply, and that's because it's a fully modular power supply, which the big advantage of it means you only need to plug in the cables that you're going to use. If you have a semi-modular or non-modular power supply, there's going to be some or all the cables plugged in, and even if you're not going to use them, they're going to be in your build. And it's a big problem for our case because there's nowhere to hide the cables at the bottom of it. The other nice thing about this particular power supply is that the cables which come with it are of quite high quality, which is great because I don't want to use cable extensions in this build, again because there's nowhere to hide them in the case and everything's going to be on display. So I would strongly recommend you get a power supply like this that's fully modular and that has nice looking cables so that you're not going to have to get cable extensions. You can buy fully custom cables, which is another option and probably a better option than using cable extensions. So we'll go ahead and plug the cables that we're going to use into the power supply. So starting off with a 24-pin connector. Okay, we're going to need one 8-pin connector for the CPU. So I'm going to plug it in down below here. We're going to need one cable for our graphics card. And then the last cable that we're going to need is a SATA cable. Okay, that's all the cables plugged in. We'll go ahead and get this into the case. Okay, next thing for us to do is to remove the power supply bracket to install onto the power supply. And it's just held on with these 3 screws. Okay, so we just line the bracket up with the back of the power supply, and we need to secure it in with some of the screws. Now, one of the nice things, this power supply comes with 4 screws which will work to secure the bracket on. The case also comes with 4 screws that will work. I've had to use 2 of them for the GPU because the smaller screws weren't able to secure the GPU. So I'm going to use 4 screws from the power supply and 2 screws from the case to secure this on. So thankfully we've got the right amount of screws, but again, if you get a different power supply and it doesn't come with these screws, you might struggle to secure it because all the other screws were too small to go into the back of the power supply. Okay, so we'll slide the power supply back into the case. And then just secure the bracket down again with the same 3 screws. Okay, so at this stage we can go ahead and plug the power supply cables into the GPU. So it takes an 8-pin and a 6-pin cable. Okay, so we'll start off with the 6-pin cable over to the right hand side. So that's just pushing and locking into place, and then the 8-pin cable goes over beside it. And again, because the graphics card isn't secured at this side, I'm just supporting it at the back of my hand. Okay, so that's the graphics card power supply installed. Okay, next thing to do is to go ahead and install our motherboard. You'll notice there's 4 standoffs in the case, which we're going to screw into. So it's important to line the motherboard up with all the ports coming out the back of the case. So we'll go ahead and insert it in. Okay, so at this stage we can go ahead and plug in as many of the cables as we can. Okay, so we've got our 24-pin power supply cable, which I'm going to route up through this little cutout in the front of the case, making sure to line it up the right way. There's a little notch on the cable which lines up with the notch on the socket. Then just push and it'll click and lock into place, and then we can pull the excess cable down below the bottom of the case. Okay, so our CPU power cable is going to go into here. So we'll just route it across and again push, and it should lock and click into place. And again, we'll just tuck the excess down at the bottom of the case. Okay, so we can now go ahead and plug our riser cable coming from our graphics card into the PCIe slot on our motherboard. So you just need to open the clip by pushing here, and we'll remove the cover protector, line things up with the socket, and then it's just firm pressure on both sides, and you hear it's clicked and locked into place. Okay, next thing for us to do is to plug these 3 front panel connectors into our motherboard. So this is a USB 3.0 cable, which is going to let the USB Type A port on the front of the case work. This is our HD audio cable, which is going to let the combined headphone and microphone jack in the front of the case work. And we've already plugged a little extension into our motherboard, so this is just going to join on to the other end of the extension. And then we've got these tricky cables to plug in. We've got a power switch and power LED positive and negative. So the power switch to let the power switch work, and then the LED to show up when the power is on. And again, we've plugged an extension cable into our motherboard, so it's just lining these up with the extension cable. So this is where we're going to plug our USB 3.0 cable into. So I'm just going to route the cable up the bottom and out the little cutout, bring it along to here, and then line the notch up with the notch on the socket. And you need to be really careful with this cable because it's the one that you can very easily bend the pins on your motherboard. So I'm just going to line this up with the socket and push it in. Okay, so that's in place, and we're just going to slide the excess cable, fold it down so it's out of sight. Okay, so we'll plug in these tricky small connectors. So this is our power switch. If we look at the back of the power switch, there'll be a little arrow in it indicating the positive pin. So we're going to line it up with our cable coming from the front panel connector. And the arrow's on this side, the arrow's on this side, so they're going to face the opposite way round to make sure that both the arrows are aligned. Okay, we've also got power LED, and these are two separate cables, one for positive and one for negative. So there's the power LED. If we turn it over, we can see that the top one has got the arrow, so it's going to be the positive one. So we're going to line it up. The one below then without the arrow is going to be the negative. So we'll plug it in as well. Okay, so we're not going to use the hard drive LED or also the reset switch because this case doesn't have one. Obviously, if our case did have additional cables, they would plug in to here. And then all I'm going to do is tuck the excess cables down into the bottom of the motherboard. Okay, so for the last of the cables to plug in, we've got our HD audio cable. You'll notice there's a little hole missing on the plug, and we've got a pin missing here. So I'm going to line those up and push it into place. And then again, it's just a matter of routing the cable down the bottom below the motherboard where it can't be seen. Okay, so the next thing for us to do is install our radiator and fan onto the bracket we removed from the top of the case earlier. So the AIO does come with its own fan, and if you were looking for the best cooling in this case, it would be ideal that you install this particular fan on the radiator. I'm going to stick with the original fan because I wanted to test how good it looks and how well it actually cools on a radiator. Okay, the first thing for us to do then is to remove the original fan from the bracket by loosening the 4 screws holding it on. And then we want to just line the bracket down with the radiator and set the fan on top. So having the fan installed this way, so the front of the fan is facing the top of the case, is going to do two things. One, it's going to act as an intake, so it's going to bring cool air in from the top of the case and blow it through the radiator, helping to lower CPU temperatures. The other thing, because the fan is facing the right way up, it should hopefully look better at the top of the case. Okay, so it's just a matter of passing the screws through the bracket and into the radiator, and then we'll screw them in. Okay, so the bracket that's on our pump head is designed for Intel motherboards, so we just need to loosen it by twisting it to the side, and then it should just snap off. Then all we're going to need to do is set the AMD one on and tighten it, and it should lock into place. Okay, so we're using our CPU cooler from new. It's going to come with thermal paste pre-applied, but because I've used it before, I'm going to have to add some thermal paste to the CPU. So I'm just going to add a pea-sized amount to the middle of the CPU. That looks about right to me. Okay, next thing to do is start to install the AIO. So I want the tubes coming out beside the RAM. I've already sized this up in the case. I think it's going to give the best layout. So I'm just going to pass this over and line it on to each of the standoffs that are in place. Okay, so that's lined up with each of the standoffs, and I'm just going to apply a little bit of gentle pressure to the top and put on each of the thumb screws that comes with this. Okay, we're going to start with opposite corners. Okay, so that's each of these hand tightened. I'm just going to give them a gentle turn with the screwdriver. Okay, so coming from our pump, we've got a power supply. It's a standard 4-pin connector, and it's going to go into the middle one of these 3 4-pin connectors at the top of the motherboard. So we just line them up with the notches, and it'll push into place. And then what we want to do is just route the rest of the cable round and out of the way. So the other cable that we're going to have to plug into the pump head is a USB cable. So it's just going to plug in to here. Okay, and the USB header is just round here beside our USB 3.0 cable that we plugged in earlier. So it's just a matter of lining up the notch with the notch on the socket and pushing into place. Okay, and then we've got some excess cable we can just tuck down at the bottom here. Okay, next thing to do is to put the radiator and fan back into the case. And then it's just a matter of getting things screwed back in again. And then we just need to put the fan cables coming from the fan back into this little cable cover bracket. Okay, and we'll put the 2 screws back in again. Okay, so we just need to plug the 2 cables coming from the fan into the motherboard. So we've got the fan power supply, as this is going to be our CPU fan. We need to plug it into the CPU fan header, which is right beside the pump fan header, which we plugged the pump into earlier. So that's plugged in. Okay, next thing to plug in is the 3-pin 5-volt addressable ARGB connector coming from our fan into our motherboard. So our motherboard only has one 3-pin 5-volt addressable ARGB header, which is here. But one of the nice things about this fan is there's a little extra connector on it, allowing us to daisy chain something else in. And as our SATA SSD is going to need a connector, this is perfect for us. So I'm just going to plug this in. You'll see here there's 1 pin a gap and then 2 pins. So I'm just going to line this up the right way on the motherboard. The other thing you'll notice, there's a little arrow on this header, and the arrow is to go with the 5-volt pin. So it's going to go this way round. And again, just take your time and try and avoid any issues with bending pins. There we go, so that's it plugged in to place. Okay, next thing for us to plug in is our SATA SSD. So to do that, we're going to have to remove this little bracket from the front of the case. So it's held on with 2 screws. Okay, so this is our SATA SSD, and we have a look at the side of it. I'll talk you through the ports. Okay, SATA SSDs tend to have 2 L-shaped connectors. The smaller one here is for the SATA data cable that we've already plugged into our motherboard, and the larger one over here is for the SATA power cable coming from our power supply. And there's an extra little connector here which is for the RGB cable. Okay, so this is the bracket from the case. All we need to do is set the SSD into the bracket, and then at the bottom there's 2 little screws to secure the SSD into the bracket. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and plug the little adapter for the RGB cable into the bottom port on the SSD. Okay, next we just need to reinsert the bracket and secure it back into place. So I'm going to feed this RGB cable around the back of the SSD. and into the little cable cutout below the 24-pin connector. Then all we need to do is take the extra cable coming from our fan and plug it into the cable coming from our SSD, lining up the arrows, which represents the 5-volt pin on each of the connectors. There we go. Okay, last thing for us to do is to plug the SATA power and SATA data cables into the SSD. There we go. And then we're just going to route the cables around the back of the SSD and out of the way. Okay, so that's everything plugged in that needs to be plugged in. The last thing for us to do is a bit of cable management. So just need to tidy up all the cables and make sure they're tucked in at the bottom beside the power supply and out of the way. Okay, last thing to do is to pop the outer glass panel back on again. And then we just need to tighten up the little thumb screws at the bottom of the case.
Strikes by my window, hits my chest right in the morning, like a warning. Could have slept here for days. I felt your heartbeat, felt your mouth breathe, but it's not real. We were close to see the sun, but clouds got in our way, and so
Okay, so that's the build complete. Next thing for us to do is to power up the PC and see if we get a boot screen. Importantly, I have put a Windows 10 bootable USB drive in the back of the PC. So if you don't know how to make one of those, I'll put a link to it in the description. Okay, so let's power the PC on and see what happens. Okay, so that's the power supply on. So we're getting lights on the AIO, lights on the motherboard, just like we should. So we'll flip the power switch and see what happens. And again, that's a good sign. We've got fans spinning and other bits of RGB lighting up. So we're just going to have a look at the monitor and see if we get a boot screen. So what we're looking for is the AZZA logo, which has just appeared. And then the next thing which will hopefully happen is it will find the bootable USB drive in the back of the motherboard, and it's going to try and boot Windows off that. So the next thing we should be seeing is the Windows logo if everything's working as it should. It can just take a few minutes for that to appear. So there we go, we've got a spinning wheel, so hopefully it's going to find the Windows drive, which it has done. So we're ready now to install Windows. So what I'll do is I'll flip over to the screen mode to give you a better look at things. Okay, so we're from the United Kingdom, so we're just going to click Next. And we're going to click Install Now. Okay, if you've got a Windows 10 product key, you can go ahead and put it in here. If you don't have one yet, click I don't have a product key. And then you need to select the version of Windows you're going to get a product key for. So I'm going to go for Windows 10 Pro and click Next. Okay, set the license terms and hit Next. Okay, and we're going to select Custom Installation. So what you can see is we have got 3 different drives installed in this computer. We've got our SATA SSD, which is this one at the top, and then we've got 2 Samsung 1TB M.2 SSDs, which are these 2 down below. So I'm going to install Windows on the Samsung SSD, so I'm going to select it here and click Next. So then Windows is just going to take some time getting everything ready and installed, so we're going to let that run. Okay, so we're now ready to start setting up Windows. Over the next lot of screens, we're going to have a range of options. I'm going to pick certain ones because they suit me. Don't feel you have to copy me and pick whichever works out best for you. Okay, I'm in the United Kingdom, so I'm going to click yes. And the keyboard is United Kingdom layout. I don't want a secondary keyboard, so I'm going to click skip. Okay, so I'm going to set the PC up for personal use and click next. And at this stage, I just need to add my Microsoft account, so I'm going to put my details in now. Okay, I'm going to create a PIN code. And we use this PIN code to log in instead of typing our password each time. Okay, I'm going to click Do Not Use Online Speech Recognition and click Accept. I'm going to click No to Location-Based Services. Find my device, No. I'm just going to send basic diagnostic data. No to inking. No again. And no again. And again, like I've said, if you have other options you want to pick, go ahead and pick different options. Okay, sync my activity, no. I'm going to click Do It Later. And I'm going to click Only Save Files to this PC. I'm going to click No Thanks to the free trial. And Not Now. Okay, so we've now got Windows installed and we're getting a little pop-up from AZZA asking us to install Armoury Crates. So this is a useful program, so we're going to go ahead and click Yes. Okay, I'm going to click I agree. And accept. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this down for now and we'll come back to it when we get to the drivers. So normally what I like to do before I install any programs, the only reason I install the Armoury Crate is the pop-up at the start came up and it saves us trying to find it later on. What I like to do at the start is get Windows as up to date as we can before we start installing any other drivers or programs. So what we're going to do is click on the Windows icon down the bottom left hand side, click on the settings and updates and security. And then we're going to go check for updates. So what we're going to do, Windows is going to go off and find a number of updates and go ahead and install them. The computer may need to restart a number of times, but we're going to do that. Keep going back and checking for updates each time the computer restarts. And then we're only going to go on to further steps once all the updates are installed and Windows is fully up to date. Okay, so that's Windows fully up to date. There's no more updates available. So before we get into installing our drivers, the next thing I like to do is to get all our SSDs to show up. Okay, so we click on the Windows icon down the bottom left hand corner, click on Documents and then click on this PC. What you'll notice that we have only one of our drives showing up, but we also have another Samsung 1TB drive and we also have a T-Force Delta 250GB drive. So to get these to show up, what we need to do is go down to the search and type in disk management. And create and format hard disk partitions will come up. We're going to click on that. Okay, so when we look here, what you'll notice is we do actually have three drives. We've got disk 0, which is our SATA SSD. Disk 1 is the drive we've installed the operating system onto. And disk 2 is the other Samsung 1TB SSD. It's important, the numbers here, you never get the full amount of storage. So we've got 931GB on a 1TB drive. And over here, we've got 232GB on a 250GB drive. So it's important to note you'll never get the full amount on the disk that you buy. You'll notice that disk 0 and disk 2 are just showing up as unallocated spaces. So before Windows is able to use our drives, we're going to need to format the drives. So we right click on the drive and click New Simple Volume. Click Next, Next, and it's going to ask us to assign a letter to the drive. It's come up as D. You can change this if we want to in the pull down menu. I'm going to leave it as D and click Next. We then can type in what we're going to call it. So we're going to call it T-Force Delta RGB and click Next. Finish. Okay, so now you can see that a drive has appeared here. We're going to repeat the same process with our second Samsung M.2 SSD. So new simple volume, next, next. It's picked the letter E, we'll leave it at that. And click next. Okay, so now if we go back down to the documents, this PC, you'll notice that we have 3 drives now appearing. We've got local disk C, we've got our T-Force Delta RGB, which has got the label D, and our Samsung 970 EVO, which has the label E. Okay, next thing to do is install drivers. We're going to get these from a variety of sources, but we're going to start over at AZZA's page. Okay, so don't worry about the links. I'm going to put links to all the pages in the description. So we select Windows 10 64-bit, and then we've got a range of drivers. Okay, so we can see what drivers we've got. We've got a VGA driver, so we're not going to need this. You're going to need this if you've got a CPU with integrated graphics, and you're going to use the HDMI or display port on the motherboard. We've actually got a dedicated graphics card where we're going to get the drivers from NVIDIA's website, so we don't need this. The BIOS, we're just going to note the number. It's 2606, so when we go into the BIOS later, if our version is behind this, we'll come back and install the BIOS update at a later stage. So we'll go ahead and get the audio drivers. We're going to click download and we're going to click open. Okay, we're going to go ahead and click on setup. And we're going to click yes, I want to restart my computer now. Okay, so that's how you'll go ahead and install a driver on this page. We've got a whole range of drivers. There's LAN drivers, wireless drivers, chipset drivers. I tend to get the chipset driver from AMD directly, which tends to be a more up-to-date version. If you're going to use RAID, there's a SATA driver, there's Bluetooth drivers, and then there's the Armoury crates, which we've already downloaded. So Windows will probably have found equally good drivers, so these are optional if you want to go ahead and install them. We do need to install the chipset driver. We could get it from here, but I much prefer to get that from AMD. So I'm going to head over to AMD's website now. Okay, so we're over on AMD's website. We're going to go ahead and select chipset. Our chipset has an AM4 socket, and we have an X570, and we're going to click submit. Okay, we've got Windows 10 64-bit, so we're going to expand this, and we've got the AMD chipset drivers, so we're going to go ahead and click download. We're going to click run, and we're going to go ahead and click yes. Okay, we're going to click install. Okay, so the chipset software has been installed, we just need to restart the computer, so I'm going to go ahead and click restart. Okay, so the next lot of drivers we need to get is for our graphics card, and we're going to get these from NVIDIA. I much prefer to install the GeForce experience rather than just getting the drivers, so I'm going to go ahead and click download now. We're going to click run, and we're going to click yes. Okay, so we're just going to agree and install. Okay, so you have an account, go ahead and put your details in now. If you don't, you can create one, so I'm going to put my details in. Okay, so we go ahead and click on drivers at the top, and over beside check for updates, there's 3 little dots here. So we click on these, we're able to choose which version of the drivers we want. So we've got game ready drivers, which you should select if you use your PC mostly for gaming, or studio drivers if you use it mostly for creative processes such as video editing. So I use mine mostly for video editing, so I'm going to click the studio driver. And what you'll see, it'll have found the version of the studio driver for us, so we're going to go ahead and click download. Okay, so I'm just going to go for express installation, so I'm going to go ahead and click this and click yes. So it's now going to go ahead and install the drivers. Be prepared for your screen to flicker during this install. It's just as the drivers are being installed and it's normal. Okay, so that's the drivers installed. We can go ahead and click close. Okay, so we're now going to head over to the Armoury crate, which we installed earlier on. And we're just going to go ahead and check that everything is up to date. So head over to the Update Center, check for updates. Okay, and we're going to hit Update All. Okay, and it wants us now to restart the system, so we'll go ahead and do that. The other useful thing about the Armoury crate is you can get your drivers from it as well. So here you've got versions of the drivers, we have installed some of them. You've got utilities, BIOS updates, it says there's no new BIOS available for us. You've got manuals and individual kits as well. So as well as getting these from AZZA's website, if you install this just at the start, you can get all your drivers directly from here. We're also going to be able to control the lighting on our motherboard and the devices that are plugged into it from here. So if we click on the Aura Sync button, so at the moment it has picked up our motherboard, it's picked up our cooler, our memory and our addressable header on our motherboard. So we can go and apply different effects to this. So at the moment you can see they're all set to rainbow. So what I can do is I can select something different. Okay, so I want to set them all to a static color. I can click static and the color is set to red. So if I go ahead and click on the red, I can pick whatever color I want. So try orange, or I can use this wheel to pick any version of that orange that I want. That's more towards a white. Or I can put in the individual code here to pick whatever color that I want as well. So we're going to click cancel here. There's a whole range of other effects. We could pick on the color cycle, where it's going to cycle through all the different colors. And then obviously we don't need to pick all the devices. If we only want to change one particular device, we only need to select the devices that we want to change. So I quite like the rainbow on it, so I'm going to go ahead and put it back to rainbow and leave it on that. Okay, so that's the PC set up just the way I want it. I've got all the drivers and programs that I'm going to need for the PC to run effectively, and I've got the lighting set just the way I want it. There is one more step that I want to do, and that's to head over into the BIOS to get the memory running at the correct speed, because this memory will run at 3600 megahertz, and I put money on it's running at just over 2000 megahertz because we're going to need to enable the XMP profile in the BIOS to get it running at the faster speed. It's also worth checking in the BIOS that the fans are running just the way we want them as well, although we've only got one fan in this build. So to get into the BIOS, what we need to do is restart the computer. And when the computer is restarting, we just need to press the delete key and that will take us into the BIOS. So we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, the easiest thing to do is just keep hitting the delete key, although I can wait for a little while before doing it. It's just as the AZZA logo comes up that we want to hit it, so I'm going to start pressing it now. There's the AZZA logo, and this is taking us into the BIOS. Okay, so we have a look over the right hand side. We can see that our memory is running at 2133 megahertz, which is much slower than what it can run at. So we either press F7 or click on the button at the bottom of the screen. We can see we've got DOCP here currently disabled. So we want to enable this, so we're going to click on the down button, click Profile 1, and then click OK. So you'll see there's Profile 1 enabled, which is 3603 megahertz, which is perfect for our RAM. Okay, next thing for us to do is to have a look at the fan. So we're going to click on Q fan control. Okay, so we have a look at the fans. This motherboard has 3 fan headers. So our CPU fan, which is the fan on our radiator, chassis fan 1, which we don't have anything plugged into because there's no more space in our case for additional fans, and the AIO pump. So let's have a look at the CPU fan first of all. Okay, so over here you can see at the bottom we've got degrees C, and up the top we've got the percent that the fan is going to run at. Obviously, as the temperature increases, the fan is going to run at a faster speed. We're on the standard profile. If we want it to run more silent, we can click the silent button, or we can click the turbo button if we want the fan to run faster. If we want full speed, we can click on the full speed button. The fan, you'll notice the extra noise in the background as the fan kicks up into full speed. Or we want to manually adjust the curves here, we can click on the manual, and then we can drag these to where we want them to go to. I'm going to just leave it on the standard mode for now because that's going to be useful for me testing it later on. And this is a 4-pin fan, so we can run it in PWM mode. So that's the only thing I'm going to click is the PWM. Looking at the AIO pump, again, this is a 4-pin header, so I'm going to enable PWM. It's going to run at 100% all of the time. There's no option to adjust that, and that would be normally how I would leave the pump on an AIO. Okay, so that's that done. We're just going to exit from here. Okay, just before we leave, we had mentioned updating the BIOS. So we can see here the BIOS version is at 14.07. And when we were on AZZA's page, there was a 2606 version of it. So we can go on ahead and update the BIOS. So we'll do that when we go back into Windows. Okay, so we've increased the RAM speed and we've now got the fans running the way we want them. So we can save this and exit by clicking down the bottom here, or by pressing F10. Okay, so it's going to give us a summary of what has changed. We're going to click OK to save. And what will happen is the computer will reboot, and as long as we don't press the delete key this time, it will load up Windows. And what we want to do is check that the RAM is running at the correct speed of 3600 megahertz. Okay, so to check the RAM speed, we just need to right click on the Windows icon and click on Task Manager. We're going to click on More Details, and we're going to click on the Performance tab, and then go down and click on the Memory. So we can see now we've got 32 gigabytes of RAM, and it's running at the 3600 megahertz, just like we wanted it to. So that's good. Okay, so the last thing for me to show you is how to update your BIOS. I wouldn't recommend you doing this unless there's a problem with your PC, because you can completely brick your motherboard by doing it if you do it incorrectly. So I'm going to show you for completeness, but like I say, if your PC is running well, leave this alone. So we're going to head back over to AZZA's website here, where we have the BIOS version 2606, and we're going to click Download. And we're going to click on Save. There's the downloads. So I'm just going to double click to open this, and there's the CIP file that we're going to want. So I'm going to copy that. And on this PC, I've already plugged in an external drive. So I'm going to paste the file onto it. Okay, so we can go ahead and restart the computer, press the delete key again to get into the BIOS. Okay, so what we're going to do is click on Tool, and we're going to use this AZZA Flash utility. So please select the BIOS update method. We're going to click via storage devices and then click Next. So we just need to find the file on our storage device. So we can see there, this is our 2606 update file. So we're going to click on it. And do you want to read this? Yes. Okay, so it's now going to ask us, do we really want to update the BIOS with this version? What is really important is that your computer does not lose power during this update. If it does, there's a fair chance you're going to brick your motherboard. So like I say, only do this if you really need to. So I'm going to go ahead and click Yes. And what you'll notice is the progress happening in the bar along the bottom. Okay, so it says update successful, system will be reset, so we're going to click OK. Okay, so you can see the BIOS is just updating the LED firmware. Okay, so I can press F1 to run setup. And what you'll notice, because the BIOS has been updated, it has reset all the changes that we've already done. So I'm going to go and put things back. If I click on EZ mode down the bottom, you can now see that the BIOS is running version 2606, which is great. Okay, so that's the build complete. I think you'll agree the PC looks absolutely great and it's running lovely and smooth. So hopefully you found this guide useful. If you have, please do me a favour and give me a thumbs up. And as well, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. I'm trying to grow the channel and your subscription will make a real difference. As well, it's going to mean you're going to be notified about the new content that I'm making, and I have got a lot of great ideas. Likewise, if you're new to the channel, check out the other videos I've made. There's loads of great PC related content on the channel, and I am planning on doing a full case review, so that should be coming fairly shortly. Okay, thanks for watching.